My name is Dr. Josephine Paladmo, and my superpower is creating business cultures that transform organisations team by team. With co-host Dr. Iain Butterworth, I discuss reactions to the days, a Netflix dramatisation of the 2011 Fukushima nuclear disaster. We talk about what it tells us about leaders managing complexity and a lot of pressure. You won't believe where this conversation takes us. Hi Iain, how you going?
I'm well, thanks. Yeah, 3 weeks since I returned from Japan, and still coming down from that wonderful high that Japan gives
Ah,
me every time.
I have never been to Japan. It's on the bucket list, and so we are inspired by Japanese culture today, and we're going to talk about something that you recommended to me before you went to Japan, which is the mini series, The Days. Do you want to just maybe give our listeners an idea of what The Days are and why you recommended I watch it?
Sure. I loved it because, well, it's about the Fukushima nuclear disaster that came in the wake of the tsunami and the earthquake, 2014, and it shows what happens when you have, I guess, a system of delegating authority to a privatized power company, which is ill-equipped to deal with the actual full extent of the disaster. And I guess watching how Japanese society deals with something like that, it is so momentous and actually could have been 100 times more devastating than Chernobyl. And through a combination of good luck, incredible risk taking by those involved, and sheer tenacity, they managed to find a way to stop the whole thing just blowing up. Um, but I guess what struck me was how, um, and again, I'm looking at this through a Western lens, but just watching how those particular social um, mores in Japanese culture both hindered and to some extent helped actually coming through to a safe resolution. I found it fascinating. I've been looking at reviews of it today, which suggests that it's too linear and doesn't actually go into enough drama and focuses too much on, what happened next and how did they deal with all the different challenges that they had. But I actually found it quite fascinating to see how a nuclear power plant didn't have enough backup systems to keep it operating and safe in the event of something like that. And just showing how it came down to people hooking up, you know, battery jumper leads to actually keep the control center going, from, using taking batteries out of their cars.
Yeah, it's pretty fascinating. And I, I read the reviews too, and I want to challenge some of the reviews. I mean, people have an opinion, but I actually really loved it, and it made me feel a lot of things. And I think we need to, I kind of read those reviews, and I think maybe they are coming from a Western perspective because the actual it was a mini series that went over, I think, about 8 or 9 episodes, and it was slow and sequential, and um, you saw very methodically what happened at times, and in particular what those staff members and the I guess the leadership around them, including the Prime Minister's office, what they were dealing with in terms of the natural disaster. And it was very methodical and sequential, but I think that it also really showed in that sequential state the very rigid way in which sort of Japanese social mores were kind of being played out. So I want to talk about that because I think that we have to view it from perhaps a cultural, an intercultural perspective. We can't just view it from our expectations of what drama needs to be. So that's one thing.
Yeah.
But before we do that, I think let's just people have may not have seen it, so let's just go through some of the major sort of highlights. So Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant experienced an accident in 2011. It lasted 7 days. And what happened was there was a massive earthquake which caused a huge tsunami, which, we on the world stage were shocked. I don't know if you remember. I'm sure you remember where you were when you were looking at that footage of all of that water coming into Fukushima. It was just devastating. I've never seen anything like that before. And then, of course, the aftershocks. And what happened was that the nuclear power plant's backup generators failed because of just the sequence of natural disasters, and also the flooding made it difficult to get into the areas to really create create change or improvements. And I think also the control room went dead, so there was no feedback about what was going on, and so the pressure was building up in those in the reactors, and they weren't aware of it. So there was lots of challenges, and what you do in the mini series is you see the people inside the plant communicating with people outside who were the minister's office, and there was a whole kind of I guess a bit of a war room around number of officials, and the communication is very stilted because the people in the power plant are waiting for instructions or waiting for orders, and as I was watching that, I was thinking, how can you just be waiting for orders from people who are outside of the power plant, and particularly in those early days? And in some ways it was really telling of the ways in which those social sort of structures were impeding the agility or the ability for the workers to act. And at times they were given orders that they didn't agree with, for example. So they were putting up some ideas about what to try to sort of alleviate some of the disaster going on, and the people external to the power plant were saying, no, don't do that, try this. And it seemed crazy to me. So although I can see why the reviewers have said it lacked drama at points, it was almost like when you read a book and you create the drama in your imagination. That's what I had watching this. I was, yelling at the screen from my perspective, but I think it was very true to the experience. So I really enjoyed that part of it. And it was extraordinary what some of those workers had to do. And they actually, many of them, really suffered very badly after the disaster. I think the foreman, who was played by an incredible role by Koji Yakusho, he, I think, died 2 years later of cancer because he, was exposed to so much radiation. And what I loved about the miniseries, too, if you love numbers, you're going to love it, because they kept talking about the pressure in the reactors, and also the amounts of radiation that they were exposed to, which was very significant because there was an amount that they were allowed to be exposed to in a year, and then you'd see the counter, and it would be that much radiation just in one visit to the reactors, so you knew it was impending doom all around, and so I enjoyed it from that perspective because I had to keep turning off my expectations of what I think drama should be.
Huh. I think too, part of the inertia and the standoffs between the various players in the response, there's no way that a nuclear power plant wouldn't have backup systems that could consider every single eventuality. And I think what shocked me was realizing that it didn't. And so people had to make stuff up as they went along, which I would have thought when you're dealing with something that can poison the earth for hundreds of thousands of years, you really want to have it sorted out, which I think is a lesson for humanity. And I guess at a global level, we're seeing that playing out with climate change as well. We just haven't thought it through, or the science isn't necessarily embedded in how things work.
And I wonder, because we would do that risk management or mitigation process and think about, well, surely they would have gone through scenarios whereby, you know, they have backup plans, and it was interesting because obviously they didn't, and I think because the disaster was also off the scale. You know, this
Yes.
is a huge disaster. But having said that, you would think that the scenario planning would include huge disaster. You know, this fails, this fails, this fails. Well, now what do you do? And it was interesting because what you saw were the actors trying to look through manuals.
Yes. I mean, they hadn't planned it seemingly for a tsunami of that size
No,
coming from an earthquake of that magnitude, whereas I would have thought if you're building a nuclear reactor next to the ocean, you
yes.
actually would need to think of the worst case scenario.
That's right. That's right. And it's interesting because when and I was mentioning this earlier to you, Ian. When you look at the national culture studies and the particularly differences between cultures, what you find is that Japan is really high on uncertainty avoidance, which means that they're not likely to, want to take risks. There's a more kind of conservative aspect to the culture, and that's played out in the social mores. So we sometimes look at Japanese culture from afar and we think that there's the way that the social systems play out, that there's a value in hierarchy and social status, but in fact you don't find that when you look at the cultural studies in Japan. What you find is that actually there's perhaps more individualism than you would think, or more of a notion that, you know, there's people don't necessarily value hierarchy. What they value is those social systems that create certainty for them. So when we were, you know, in the show, when they were deferring to the Prime Minister's office, for example, you know,
Yes.
I was reading that as, oh, that sounds like it looks like they're really deferring to a hierarchical kind of power structure there, but it's actually about that is a routine or a practice that helps that culture avoid uncertainty. And so, you know, when you think about that, you would also expect that they would have perhaps gone to, you know, the lengths around risk management, but maybe that's not the way in which that culture plays out, or that element of culture plays out, because it's, if you rely on social systems to provide certainty, then you're not thinking maybe about those other ways in which you can provide certainty, which is some of the things we think about when we do scenario planning around risk. I don't know, I'm just kind of guessing.
There were a couple of hapless characters, I think, within the Prime Minister's office who were meant to be providing him with um, frank and fearless scientific evidence about the current state of play, and they seemed to be not saying anything. And
Exactly.
they were sort of presented as the fall guys for the I guess what happens when that culture doesn't work properly.
Yes.
Um, but the Prime Minister's own behaviour, I think, he was presented as someone with anger management problems and being a bit of a bully. I mean, which I think may firstly show the gravity of the situation, but maybe he needed to find a way to actually allow those people to express uncertainty or say they didn't know without fear of being punished for that.
Yeah, exactly. And but you know, he was for me, it was an interesting presentation of a protagonist in his character, because I think what he was trying to do was disrupt those social norms. He was
Huh.
saying, just tell me the truth, you know, you're
Okay.
supposed to be the expert, just tell me the truth.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that but because that behavior is so misaligned to the ways in which those social norms normally play out, it just perhaps wasn't effective in the end. And you're right, you know, the emotional range that he displayed was very, you know, immature in a way. So he looked like a boy having a tantrum rather than someone, you know, trying to get to the core root of a problem. But you could see that he was very frustrated, and I was frustrated watching it too,
Yeah.
because it was so frustrating to see the saving face, you know, that
Yes.
was going on. So even though there was such a dire problem, there was still a lot of saving face around that. And interestingly, even the workers, there was a real poignant part of the miniseries where the younger workers go to the foreman, and by the way,
Yeah.
they were in this situation for 7 days. No one was getting any sleep. You can
Oh my
imagine,
goodness.
and the younger workers go to the foreman and they say, "Just let us leave. We want to
Yeah.
leave." This was at a point where they just were losing hope, and then the foreman asks, the superiors again, can we evacuate some of the staff? And it was that was rejected. They weren't
Oh.
allowed to. And you can see that there's this, there's this sense of futility around that. If we're all, it's almost like everyone needs to, why can't we save some of you? And in the end, the foreman's behaviour was, he went against some of those, I guess, directives in the
Yes.
end, and just started to take control himself.
Yes,
And that was
that's
when
right.
the social systems really were disrupted completely. But it wasn't because this prime minister was trying to, kind of exert control. It was actually when the foreman himself said, right, we're in this, we have to deal with it, we have to sort this out.
I mean, the takeaway for me was they didn't really understand how the pressure came down in some of the, I think two reactors still were building up pressure in their tanks. And at the end of the day, no one really understood how that pressure came down. And it was just an incredible stroke of good fortune that it happened in a way that no one really understood. Otherwise, we would be having a very different conversation right now.
Absolutely, absolutely. It would have been. I think at one stage, I think they mentioned that it could be. It could have been all of the, the whole country as well as other countries impacted. It would
Yeah.
have been, or the northern part of the world even. So yeah,
Yes.
it would have been dire, absolutely dire. And I it's interesting, isn't it, that I think that is like, for me, the lesson too is this is a situation that was highly complex, highly ambiguous, and you can see how the things that perhaps had brought the company success in the past just weren't working. Because you can imagine there's this idea of going into a manual to try to learn how to deal with a problem you're facing that is dire. It's not about going into a manual. It's actually about bringing people together, and you really need to get the smarts in the room working, and you need to get enable creativity. And to your point, you need to enable an environment where people can fail or can present ideas that might fail, and they need to do that quickly. Whereas the fallback, the default was, there must be an answer in our manuals. and that's in some ways it's an engineering approach, or when you're dealing with complicated systems, there'll be a manual and you can work through that system in a rational way. But there was just no way that they could work in that way to solve this problem.
So, what do you think might happen now with the advent of Chat GPT? Do you think they're uploading manuals into the cloud, and God forbid there's another disaster? Would people be trying to consult, you know, some sort of AI mechanism to maybe come up with solutions?
And that, isn't it an interesting analogy? I actually don't. Interestingly, a lot of the discussion around AI and responsibility of using AI responsibly, and whether we should slow down the progress and all of that, has actually been a reaction to knowing that we are in chaos around it. So there is no, because we don't really understand the complexity. So I think that the complex system is moving beyond our understanding, and so in a way, you can run. There's a lot of parallels between what happened in the day's portrayal of Fukushima and what we're experiencing with AI. And I think some of it will be luck that we
Yeah.
end up at the other end, and maybe some of it will be about in some ways, the world's leaders, experts, thinkers, and all of us, because we're all weighing in to this discussion as well, which is great. We need all of us to weigh in and think about some of the ethical implications of AI so that we can mitigate some of those down the track. I think it's a really good discussion that we're having. I don't think anybody has a solution to it, though.
What about the sort of generic psychological concepts of groupthink and the sorts of conundrums that face organizations, possibly worldwide? Do you think there were elements of basic psychological behaviors in a group setting that were on display in the days that maybe transcend the specific culture of Japan?
That's an interesting question. I guess definitely a sense of probably not almost compliance, but it's not quite compliance. There was a sense of seeking comfort. So I think every time there was a possible solution offered and there was action around that possible solution, there was a sense of ameliorating discomfort around that. So, and that they would then, although some of the solutions were very difficult to implement, but I think that there was a sense of going back to wanting to go back to a kind of homeostatic state where we know what we're doing. So there was always a sense of wanting to go back to, yes, we know what we're doing. We've got a plan. And even the dialogue between the leaders and the workers on the ground were always about trying to get to certainty. And maybe that is actually a competing demand in a way, because when you're dealing with complexity, you actually need to open up creativity and innovation and, kind of in some ways blue sky thinking around things. And if your aim is trying to get back to certainty, then you're probably going to miss some avenues or miss some ways to solve problems that you're not quite thinking about. So I think that there was something around that. I don't know, I don't know. I couldn't see groupthink necessarily. Definitely lots of wanting to save face as well. Definitely lots of that. And, just, on the positive side of humanity, just some really courageous individuals, obviously, that were very, that were putting their own health at risk for the benefit of others. And there was, definitely that altruistic sense of working together. And a camaraderie that was formed actually at the worker level as well. They were all kind of, that team-based camaraderie was there. But I think that when I think about it, that cultural element of uncertainty avoidance was really playing out all the time. We want to get to a solution. This one will work. And then they try and fail. And
I
then
wonder if, say, all the nuclear power generators in Japan were state-owned. I wonder what the response might be, because you had an organization, you had a corporation trying to save face at a corporate level.
Exactly, that's right.
And the sense that there were two different tribes. There was the state, there was the federal government at one level, and you had the corporation at the other. And I think part of the breakdown was it wasn't just individuals trying to save face, it was at an organizational level too. And I just wonder how well, like, human decision making in an environment where something might actually blow sky high and potentially shut down the whole Japanese economy and require the relocation of 100 million people. I don't know about you, but I mean, I don't even function that well when I can't find my credit card. I don't know. I mean, how does human thinking and decision making go at that when the stakes are that high?
Exactly. And you could see it. There was almost the organizational machinations were ineffective, because you could see that it was about even the delay in really getting assistance in from other experts. So it took days for the announcement to go out globally and for global experts to help. There was a delay there, and the delay first came from the organisation itself, the company itself, not wanting to, I guess, admit that there was a real problem there. But I saw that in the way that the in some ways that the government acted as well. I could see there was more similarities between the government and the corporation. I don't know
Yes.
if the privately owned aspect here, particularly in this case, made much of a difference because, I guess, of the cultural elements at play. But you could see that, we have this in some ways in AI. It's private sector driving this. Where is government in this? Government are actually 10 steps behind right now in terms of what we're doing with AI.
So for me, extrapolating the Fukushima example to the global climate emergency that we're clearly in now, I mean, if I'm thinking about the governor of Texas and the terrible heat dome that's been existing over southern US and northern Mexico during the month of June and July, the Texan governor has stripped out occupational health and safety provisions for people working outside, and I believe that it's due to his own ideological position that denies climate science when you've got the whole of the Texan economy propped up to a large extent by fossil fuel industry, and I'm imagining that his political party is resourced extensively by fossil fuel interests. I somehow see some echo of the Fukushima example with the sort of denial of the true gravitas of a situation and the unwillingness to actually acknowledge to citizens that there is an emergency playing out in real time. And I guess I understand that governments don't wish to unnecessarily alarm people and create mass panic. But at the same time, there must come a point where you can't actually pretend that everything's okay, and you actually have to acknowledge that, you know, the normal rules of engagement don't apply, and that different responses are required. I
Yeah.
don't have an answer,
No,
but yeah, what
I
are your thoughts
agree.
about that? Yeah.
I agree. I think that there has to be a point at which particularly we acknowledge that new rules or old rules don't apply and new rules are required, new norms are required. And so, because for example, that Texan example, the governor could have easily have strengthened some of the health and safety regulations in in recognition that
Yes.
there is a climate emergency here. So you and I think unfortunately we have these competing demands. And what I mean by competing demands, they're commitments that on their own have very good intentions behind them. So, for example, the commitment to want to provide safety and security to the population or the community or your workforce to, not unnecessarily provide stresses for them. Some of that is a great commitment that shows care. But on the other side, this commitment about bringing, creating a version of yourself as an organization or even as a state, for example, state of Texas, providing a version of yourself that's an ideal self that doesn't acknowledge some of the real challenges that you have, that again it will compete against our understanding of what we really need to do. And I think that the problems we face is how do we really face into problems that make us feel vulnerable and sometimes hopeless, and because we don't know. And it's about that facing into problems and really understanding and acknowledging and expressing that we don't know. That takes a lot of bravery, and it takes a culture that allows for that.
So going back to the organizational framework, I've always loved the work of Dalmau and Dick and the diagnostic manual for looking into organizational uncertainty and doubt. And they talked about very superficial issues at the levels of procedures and practices, things that you can sort out quite quickly But then at a deeper level of uncertainty and doubt is the level of goals and direction. And those are still largely conscious things. But when you go even deeper into the bedrock of an organization, you're actually dealing with the unconscious life of an organization and the shared vision and identity and deep sense of purpose and mission, which I think when calamity strikes, either internally or externally, you actually get shaken right to the bedrock of,
Yes.
who are we? Why are we here? Do we like each other? What's the dream hold keeping us all together? Why do I come to work every day? I get the sense that maybe these sorts of emergencies, whether they're visceral ones at the level of Fukushima or whether they're sort of the slow boil that we're now going through with climate, at some point at an organizational level and a societal one, we're actually having to face some very deep existential questions about who we are and what are we doing, is the game over? Do we have to come up with a new way of seeing that actually renders the old one defunct?
Exactly, exactly. And I think to your point, I don't have the answers to that either, but I think having conversations where we even just explore what those doubts are, because I like that framework too. I love that. What are the doubts here? Because that then unearths the things we sometimes don't feel like we can talk about. And from a very practical application at an organization, you could be asking staff, what are the doubts? And I know you've done some work around this. What do they doubt about being here, or about this organizational purpose, or about what are those deep worries that they have? And I think sometimes in a culture where we're goal focused, promotion focused, we sometimes don't allow for that. For the shadow. We don't allow for the dark shadow, and we can't avoid the shadow. The shadow is part of the light. And so, but we need a really respectful way of, discussing that, and then obviously not leaving people in that. You need a way of doing that carefully. And so I it's not for the faint-hearted. And I'm not suggesting that for example, manager A go to work tomorrow and say, okay, everybody, we're going to go into our shadow today. It actually requires a bit more care than that, and it also requires really skillful facilitation. But you can actually elicit what that shadow is, and then have a discussion about, well, what would we do about that? I think that would be amazing. Yeah.
In the old days, you would be having an ear out for the conversations at the water cooler in the office. I'm not quite sure what it's like now post-pandemic, with so much virtual stuff going
Yeah.
on.
You have to have deliberate spaces to talk about it, because what we get now, particularly with with hybrid working, people are in the office, but they're not there all the time. And when we bring people together, we often perhaps are erring on bringing people together for a positive experience or a positive conversation, or planning for the future, and being involved and co-creating the future, which is fabulous, and using some of the sort of tenets of positive psychology. We're building on strengths, and we're not necessarily going into doubts and shadow and the things that we're scared about. And so, but I think that you can allow for that. You can absolutely allow for that, but as I say, you have to do it skillfully.
Yes. Well, hopefully we won't be dealing with a Fukushima scenario anytime
Yes.
soon.
Yes, that's right.
But
And interestingly, interesting conversation, Ian. So, we've gone from Fukushima all the way down to AI, and then all the way down to, how to apply it in, how to elicit some of that uncertainty and doubt in organizations. And there are strands here, there's sort of like, I think what we've done today is sort of thrown up some of these strands, and we'll just see where they land.
all right, I'll go and put some plastic sheeting down, see what happens.
All right. Well, lovely to speak to you, Ian. We'll
All
talk soon.
right.
All
Yeah.
right.
Bye.
Bye.